We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, I'm going to be talking about some similarities and some differences between $500 watches and $5,000 watches. One of the best things about watches and the watch community and watch collecting is that it can attract so many different people from all different parts of the world, as well as interests in watch collecting, including price points, branding, types of watches, functions, and so many other different variations. So depending on who you're talking with, you'll always have a different conversation. So that's one of the most interesting things that I love about watches, just the great variance in the types. And whenever I get calls, and actually I got an email recently from someone that was new to watch collecting and they wanted to know the similarities and differences. So I figured I would share this with you because I've had so many different watches in my personal collection at all different price points and brands and types, and also through delraywatch.com where we buy, sell, trade pre-owned watches, and now also new watches, which is a new addition, by the way. We have a bunch of brands, including Parmigiani Fleurier, Omega, Zenith, and Breguet, and some of the other greats, so check that out. But the point is we get so many different types of watches through the door, and I've come up with some similarities and differences, and I think it might be shocking to some that there may even be more similarities than differences. So let's jump right through it. And if you haven't checked me out on Instagram already, I'm on Instagram, The Real John P, where I'm trying to make more of a commitment to post more things, including cool little watches in my collection and what we get here in the doors. So first, the differences and similarities between $500 and $5,000 watches is the case construction. Now, case construction typically at these two very different price points is going to be great. There's going to be a great difference in the case construction. Typically, $500 is using cases that are produced in places where it's cheaper to manufacture, but at that cost savings, they can oftentimes invest into higher end polishing or putting more difficult angles on the cases if the cases are produced there. Whereas when you have a watch where all the components are produced in Switzerland or countries where the labor costs are a lot higher and the labor costs are a lot larger part of the value of the watch, you're going to have much more delicate and refinement in the case finishing. There's the likelihood for more difficult angles and complex angles and mixtures of angles, as well as the brushing and the polishing and the different textures of the metal. It's going to be a lot more sophisticated. And of course, that's because they can put in that extra effort because they have much more buffer room. Though I'll say at the $500 and thereabout price point, even easier when you get into pre-owned, some micro brands are starting to focus a lot on case construction and be able to offer that to you to be closer to what you're going to get in a $5,000 watch because they're cutting costs in other places, and one of those large places that costs are being cut is marketing. Let's not forget that in a $5,000 watch, you have a lot of baked costs, including marketing, including branding, and other things. So we'll talk about that later. But number one, generally, the case construction is going to be a lot more refined on a $5,000 watch, but it may not make a difference, especially if you're wearing the watch for sport or something else. And at $5,000, there's even more room to be had in case finishing and construction and materials as well. But that's kind of the two price points we're working with here for that purpose. Next, we have sapphire crystals. Sapphire, I remember 15 years ago when brands were really finalizing the switch over from mineral and plastic and glass over to sapphire. You know, sapphire is a hardened material that is resistant to scratches, though it cracks a little bit easier than something like a mineral or a hesselite from Omega. It does crack easier with direct blunt force, though it's very scratch resistant. And about 15 years ago, brands started moving towards that. Prior to that, having a sapphire crystal really meant that you had a much higher quality, much more expensive watch, but now watches that are a few $100s include sapphire crystals. Sometimes it's becoming increasingly more popular as these materials are more widespread, they're easier to obtain, and you don't absolutely need to manufacture these things in places of the world where the labor costs are high. And that's going to be a recurring theme that we're going to see, is the difference in labor costs based on where the watches are created. Obviously, with Switzerland having very highly paid labor force comparatively to some parts of the world where other brands are sourcing their parts and potentially assembling them in Switzerland. Next, we have the movements. Now, this is a big one, and this one is a little bit controversial, but only to some. So let me explain. When we have automatic movements, and let's just assume that we're talking about watches that both have automatic Swiss movements. It doesn't really matter the origin so much, but let's say they're automatic movements. A watch that's $5,000, generally speaking, is going to have much more attention to detail in actually assembling, regulating, and tinkering with the movement, in simplistic terms, what watchmakers are doing to the movement to make sure that it keeps the best time that movement can. When we talk about a $5,000 watch, let's throw out Omega Seamaster 300 Professional with a ceramic bezel. This watch not only meets chronometer specs, it also goes through Omega's own set of specifications for timekeeping, and they put the watch in the movement in different positions, and we call that regulating to different positions. Whereas when we're talking about a $500 watch, to regulate a watch in that many positions, I mean, you can ask Hans, our watchmaker, he will regulate it to all the positions. That may take 20, 30 minutes, sometimes longer, just if it's an older movement. And then you have a lot of observing and watching it and putting it through testing and putting it on this circular winder that actually he has hanging on his walls. And some watchmakers have even more sophisticated, depending on their laboratory, like if you're a manufacturer, and they observe and they test these watches over time to make sure that they keep these timekeeping specifications. But that takes a lot of time, and at scale they can do this no problem, but at a smaller scale and a lower price point, it becomes incredibly difficult to do this. So in short, it doesn't mean that a $500 watch cannot keep as great timing if you put both on timegrapher timekeeping machines. You take a time reading, measure the amplitude, the seconds, and the beat error on a $500 watch. It may be the same or better than a $5,000 watch. Out of the factory, probably not, but it could be, right? We're talking about mechanical components, things that break. There's oils, there's greases, lubricants, and there's gears, and you just never know in the real world. It's much different than in a laboratory where everything is hermetically sealed and there's no dust and the humidity is very controlled. You put things in the Florida sunlight and heat, and all of a sudden, what are you going to get? So there's some variance on that level, but generally speaking, the $5,000 watch is very likely, if not almost definitely, going to have better timekeeping at scale, not necessarily anecdotally, taking two examples, but at scale, using statistics, it's just going to, because of the amount of time and effort that highly paid labor is putting into the watch. And I think that's a very important thing to note when people start talking about time graphers and timekeeping. This is something that we really have to take into account when we're watch collectors and what we expect from our timekeeping machines. Next, if the watch happens to be a chronograph, you're not going to see a column wheel chronograph. Now, there's a couple different types of chronographs, but essentially this version of a chronograph has a wheel and it's mechanical, and you know it by pushing the chronograph's buttons. When you push the buttons, it feels very mechanical. You feel it hard, and you feel a click and a push, and those that are very into chronographs and watch collecting, they know it right away. You take a Valjoux 72, you push that pusher, and it just feels very manual, very clicky. It's like almost, I would liken it to someone, driving a stick shift car. You feel it in a certain way. Whereas when we talk about different types of chronographs, it's not quite the same thing. And that probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference to many people, but it's something nice to know and nice to have for those that are really into the intricacies. So it really has nothing to do with the actual timekeeping of the chronograph, but it's just kind of something in the back of people's heads. That one's thrown in there as a bonus. It'll mean something to some people and they'll know right away, but generally this doesn't come up that often. Next, usually the watches that are lower in price point do not have as high of a water resistance rating as watches that are higher in price point. Now, it just depends on the watch, right? If the watch is made for diving, made for sporting, it's going to increase the likelihood that it's going to have a deeper water resistance. But if the watch is made for diving but is lower in the price point, they may not even have the machines necessary to test the watches to those depths. Typically, we have something like a 100-meter water resistance test that most brands will use, and many watches, even including some dress and casual watches, go up to 100 meters. But when we talk about real sophisticated dive watches, Then we need to get into 300 meters. It doesn't mean that you're going to use it necessarily, but it's just kind of become an industry standard set forth by the greats such as Rolex, Submariner, Omega Seamaster, and many others have adopted that depth rating. And something else to keep in mind is that when we talk about the water resistance rating, it does degrade over time as the seals start breaking down and you start wearing it and start increasing the motion and friction and things like that, and you start knocking it around and somehow dust gets involved in the different humidity levels and the changing of humidity and the water and maybe salt water gets introduced to the case. The cases are going to start losing water resistance rating. And when we talk about a watch that starts out with a 100-meter water resistance rating, like, it seems fine out of the gate, but after time, let's say you don't service your watch, you don't get it tested, 10 years go by, the water resistance rating is likely going to be so low. But when you compare that with a watch that started out with a 300-meter, it has a lot more meters to lose in the water resistance rating. And when you start moving your arm and splashing around in the water, that's much different than just kind of plunking the watch in and testing it. And so, in my opinion, I think that's why a lot of this buffer room is given to certain dive watches at certain price points. But generally speaking, you buy a watch off the shelf, you really can swim with it no problem, 100 meters, even 50 meters. I mean, you can do it, unless, you're a Jacques Cousteau kind of guy or you're actually looking to dive. Maybe I wouldn't recommend it just out of principle, but you could do it. You can do it no problem. So there's similarities there in that regard. You're not going to use the depth rating on the watch, but just know that there is a depth rating difference between the two price points. So something else that gets factored into the price. Next, the bracelet and the strap on the $500 watch unfortunately are going to be worse. Now, when we talk about leather and certain types of fine leather, alligator, crocodile, maybe even throw ostrich in there, that gets expensive. And now that there's regulations in certain parts of the world, as well as you need to have a CITES certificate for that import of the animal into the United States and other countries that partake in that treaty with protected animals for certain types of leather. And now California, you cannot even have that type of alligator or crocodile depending on the origin. It becomes more difficult, and that's extra things that have to be done. And so when we start talking about $500 watch, if it looks like it's alligator or crocodile, it's very likely going to be embossed or imprinted. I don't think it's a big deal because, myself included, even if it's a $5,000 watch, I typically take the leather strap that comes on the watch off anyways and throw it aside or sell it and recoup some cost, because generally the straps are just not what I like personally. So I always like to mix it up and put something interesting and cool. And so I think at that $500 price, it actually introduces opportunity for you to swap out the strap and put something cool on. Even if you want genuine alligator or crocodile, there's some decent options out there, or some cool vintage inspired straps, maybe $100, $200, which I get it. It's a large percentage of the price of the watch, but the brand is using that as a way to cut costs. And so you still have the opportunity to get there, but it might not be there out of the gate. And when we talk about a $5,000 watch, generally the straps are going to be top quality, very high end. Some brands, yeah, they cut a little bit here and there, but I'm actually pretty surprised at what some of these brands are able to do currently today at scale with the straps, even though I don't use them. So it really goes to show that it doesn't play the largest role in choosing the watch. It's swappable. But when you talk about the bracelets on a $500 versus a $5,000 watch, there's going to be a huge difference in quality. Now, this is a little over maybe 57 for the Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39. And I'll say that, while I enjoy Rolex, I'm not the biggest fan necessarily of them all the time. I think they make a great casual watch. But one thing I think they absolutely knock it out of the park with, and this is a good example of this price point, I believe, because I think they probably do it one of the best at this price point, is the bracelets on these watches are so buttery on the wrist. Typically you just think, oh, it's just your standard stainless steel bracelet. They have this curvature on the inside of these links where it just fits on your wrist so buttery, and that's something that I don't really see too often, if at all, at the $500 price point. So if we're talking about bracelet watches and the feel of the bracelet is something that you just have to have, you don't want to put the watch on the NATO, you don't want to put it on an aftermarket strap, you want that high quality feeling, smooth, buttery bracelet, and there's going to be guys out there that are going to know right away Maybe there are some aftermarket options that tick off the box, especially if you get into like a mesh bracelet or something like that. I think there's like a Code Straps website or something like that that sells some decent German-made stainless steel bracelets. But perhaps if you want something stock, you may want to either save or spring yourself into something at that price point. Though keep in mind, you can oftentimes get $5,000 watches for maybe $2,000 pre-owned. So you can still kind of get there. It's a bit of a jump from $5,000 to $2,000, but that's just something that is something we need to consider when looking at watches as a whole and what you actually want from your watch. Next, we have the brand recognition. This one is going to sound a little bit snobby, but some people do care about this. I personally don't really care. I have a very eclectic collection, and also at Delray Watch, we sell so many different brands, and they don't necessarily have to have the most clout or the most recognition in the industry. We love so many brands that are nice, but people don't really necessarily have them on their short list to acquire them. We believe in value. I love it. It's great. But when we talk about the brand recognition, many people, they still like kind of the blue chip brands, the Rolex, the Omega, things like that. And with that comes price. So when we look at a $500 versus a $5,000, it's unlikely, with some exceptions, that $500 is going to have brand recognition out there in the market, especially when you kind of stray away from the Seikos to get into something that maybe offers a little more value for the money. Because, you know, Seiko also has a marketing budget, a large marketing budget, including celebrities, so that's baked in even to the cost of those watches. But when you look at some watches that don't necessarily have the biggest marketing budget or the brand recognition, there's some value to be had. But if you need that, you need the recognition, you want other watch collectors to say, hey, that's this model XYZ, very cool, let's have a conversation, you might have to pay for the brand recognition, which unfortunately includes sponsorships for golf and race car drivers and everything else. It's baked into the watch, and it is a huge difference between $500 and $5,000 watches. And lastly, this one is not going to matter for a whole lot of people, because I've noticed in the watch community, many people are kind of do-it-yourself guys. When people call us or they work with us, so many people have watch resizing toolkits, and they know how to do the straps, and they have time graphers, and there's a lot of do-it-yourself people, and I love to see it. It's one of the things that make watches and watch collecting so great is people really love to be educated and go on YouTube and talk with each other and go on the forums. It's so nice to see. But when we talk about the difference in $500 to $5,000 watches, after sales service and service in general is very likely to be much worse on the lower priced watch. Now, it's just, once again, something that comes baked into the price of the watch. When you buy a $5,000 watch, they're assuming that a certain percentage of people are going to use their chat feature online. A certain percent of the people are going to use their forms, are going to register their serial numbers, are going to have questions, are going to try to get extracts from archives. And so that has to get factored and baked into the cost of the business and ultimately the fractional costs of the goods that they're selling. That's something they have to consider. And so when we talk about watches that are running so close to the bone, so close to the margin at $500, it becomes really difficult to offer all of these services and to give away baseball hats. And, you know, when you walk into the boutique for them to give you champagne, or in the case of Breitling, sandwiches. Breitling in the Aventura Mall in Miami area, Florida, they give you sandwiches. They have a full menu there. And all of that is baked into the cost of the watches. So when we just look at it in terms of numbers, there's a lot less you can bake into a $500 watch than you can a $5,000 watch, just because based on the margin. So for many people, they don't care. But once again, some people like the whole experience and they may actually care. Myself, not necessarily the biggest deal, nice to have, but I'm a watch dealer too at the end of the day, so it's not like I am going to Breitling for a sandwich. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is there anything that I missed on this list of differences between $500 and $5,000 watches? I would love to hear it in the comments below. Also, do any of you think I'm just simply wrong on any of these points as well? I always love hearing everyone's viewpoint, everyone's feedback, and once again, it's one of the things that I love about watches, watch collecting, and the watch industry so much is all of the people out there like you that are willing to engage with people in the industry and fellow collectors. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.